All right, let's discuss the events in Kyiv, the resignation of the highly popular defense minister Fedorov. Why do you think this was done?
Let's split this into two questions because a lot has already been said, including by me, about why it was done. I will answer that. I'll answer it in connection with the previous question.
Mm-hmm.
By asking the next question, you yourself just explained exactly how Putin reacts to the strikes on wildberries and everything else. Everything that happened in Kiev last week is an inspiring event for the Kremlin because this is exactly the scenario that the Kremlin is counting on the most. The Kremlin hasn't actually counted on some brilliant victory on the ground, as they like to say, in a fair and open battle for a long time. The Kremlin expects that constant, continuous, vile pressure on Ukraine, given the youth of this state, the peculiarities of the national mentality, and the state of the Ukrainian elites, will lead to a collapse of the power system, to internal discord and wavering, to a split in the elites, and ultimately it will crack and burst from internal tension, and the referee will shake Putin's hand, the referee whom he, of course, tried to hit but missed. So, from my point of view, no matter what happened there, and we'll poke around under the hood now and try to understand it, we must understand the external significance, regardless of what Zelensky's goals were or what multifaceted domestic political tasks he might have set. This is all happening against the backdrop of a fierce war, terrible pressure from a cruel, fundamentally unprincipled enemy who usually doesn't let such things go unpunished. In other words, this is definitely a weakening. This is a signal of the weakening of Ukraine's position when something like this happens. And this is certainly, at the very least, inspiring information for the Kremlin because it confirms their basic hypothesis about an exit strategy. We will hold out and they will crack and burst. Now, well, strictly speaking, the what and why, the reasons, and the exact details. There are four levels, probably three or four levels, on which this can be considered. The first is the level of the duck test. The test, remember, if something swims like a duck, quacks like a duck, and looks like a duck, then it most likely is a duck. That is, if some of President Zelensky's actions look like clearing the electoral field, if the nature of the appointments indicates that popular figures who could compete with him are being removed first and foremost. And if all this is happening along with a careful attempt to experiment with electoral laws, which is happening quietly, then perhaps this event is somehow connected to some abstract possibility of holding elections in Ukraine. At the same time, when I say this, and I said it as soon as it happened, I don't mean that this is a signal that there will be elections. Not necessarily. But these are certainly some preliminary measures being taken just in case elections do happen, like there's a war, but we're ready, you know? It's like there's a war, and I'm like, but here it's there are elections, and we're ready. And if we look at the nature of the changes that have occurred, first of all, we'll see a kind of purging of the younger generation. A popular one, I'd call it the generation of Stalin's people's commissars, because Stalin had this policy, and it was, in principle, extremely effective, because the defense industry was pulled up by people who were 35 to 40 years old. He removed all the old-timers and put in people who, frankly, should have just been assistant shop managers. But it was these people, with their energy and completely new approaches, who pulled through the USSR's defense industry at that critical moment. And Zelensky seemed to start bringing these people in, but then he realized that his locomotive wasn't pulling them, that the cars are starting to move ahead of schedule and are beginning to run in front of the locomotive. And the cars that run in front of the locomotive, they get thrown off the tracks. You see? So the first one there, Svirodenko, 40 years old, she's gone. Who are we replacing her with? Koretsky, 48 years old, that's an age closer to Zelensky's age, more relatable. Most importantly, a no-name who is personally loyal to him. Next, after all the manipulations, A security official in the Ministry of Defense, someone predictable. And in place of this security official, Kamara, comes a complete insider, a kind of, Tkacheva from Zelensky, as they say. That is, the overseer for the SBU, who was in a secondary role there, becomes the head of the SBU. Well, it hasn't been confirmed yet, but clearly the attempt is being made. So, next, Umarov, who handles the entire negotiation process, disappears somewhere, and another no-name security official takes his place. This means that the NSDC simply drops out of the negotiation process because the Minister of Internal Affairs is a nobody in these processes, no one knows him, and so on. And again, people from the immediate security circle. What does all this mean? It all means that, from my own personal point of view, Zelensky is, in fact, learning to govern without the office of the president. Here is the second layer, which I haven't voiced yet, and my feeling is that, ultimately, we don't hear the keyword Budanov anywhere. And here one gets the feeling that Zelensky wants to build a power vertical under himself as much as possible, without any intermediaries. And in this sense, he is practically completing a Putin-style power vertical in Ukraine. Now, Putin's security vertical is centered directly and entirely on him. All of these people in positions of control, the men with guns, are all hanging from his fingers, just like puppets. There is no Veno there. There is no Mishustin there. There are no other people between Putin and the men with guns. In Ukraine, President Zelensky has traditionally made use of a system of power, much like the one seen in the early days of Putin, or even the enduring style of the long-serving Yeltsin, where there was always a grand vizier standing between him and the apparatus. It was Boden, if I remember the name correctly. It was Yermak. Then an accident happened with Yermak, and he was replaced by Budanov, who is completely unsuitable for this position, so it was a forced replacement. And now Zelensky is trying to dissolve the office of the president altogether, in my view, as an institution. So, this set of measures, besides its abstract electoral significance, is, in my view, Zelensky's attempt to learn to deal with a hostile, or at least not fully trusted office of the president, and to center everything directly on himself. That's the second layer. The third layer is indeed a growing conflict among the elites, views on the conduct of the war and so on, which is really happening because of pressure from Russia and Putin, because the conflict between Fedorov and Syrsky is, well, not made up. It's not accidental. And it's like a conflict between two approaches to the war. The romantic one and the cruel and realistic one. This is exactly in the spirit of your questions, like why did they suddenly decide to strike wildberries? Because this young generation of effective managers, in principle, they are good, but in laboratory conditions. Some things, well, they come up with great ideas. They optimize very well. But unfortunately, this war hasn't yet become like that. It has this tendency, it's become a drone war. It feels like a computer game. But it's not a computer game just yet. Still, 80% of this war is blood, mud, swearing in the trenches. And that's what it all rests on for now. So there's a tendency for the war to change, but it's an intermediate stage. And from my point of view, the paradoxical situation is that Zelensky's motives are clear. Well, he's annoyed with Fedorov, who attributed certain successes, including collective ones, in the war's turning point over the last months to his own name, and not to the name of the one who gave him this job. Well, honestly, that's not how things are done, but it happens in youth. But besides that, Zelensky really, from my point of view, had no choice but to side with Syrsky, because Zelensky, well, who sees the whole picture, he understands that, with all due respect to drones, for now everything rests on the ruthlessness of the lower level commanders at the front. So this is also a problem of this kind of choice of elites. Well, and one last factor I've already mentioned in passing, but it does exist. Well, there's a trait of Zelensky's, and we've seen it repeatedly. It's this personal jealousy of others' fame. He cannot allow successes in the war to be associated with any other name but his own. And that's why we saw this story with Zaluzhny, and we see this story with Fedorov. If Syrsky were to become super popular now, he's not super popular now, but if he were to become super popular, then he would lose his position.